Many people would say that America was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, that these ideas are infused throughout our founding documents and the founding generation broadly. These principles bring a certain set of ethics into our public life. But there are also plenty of people today who would say that ethics is just completely devoid of our political culture. It's completely fallen by the wayside. Well, today's episode features an organization called the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which incorporates that Judeo Christian cultural aspect into its thinking about public policy. And as the name implies, EPPC couples its work with a keen attention to culture and ethics. And that makes it stand out among DC think tanks. EPPC has been around a long time, for 50 years, and has remained a prominent voice on the right as American culture and politics has continued to evolve, shall we say, over the past half century, even over the past few years. And in that respect, EPPC is similar to American Institute for Economic Research, or AIER, which we featured just a couple episodes ago in episode 109. Both institutions are well respected, and their leaders have been thoughtful in how they position the organizations against a backdrop of a fracture on the right, with the Freedom Conservatives and the National Conservative factions, and probably some other flavors in there as well, as we explored in our previous series. In episode 109, Sam Gregg described AIER's work to promote virtue and liberty, a fusion of classical liberal ideas that best aligns with freedom conservatives. And today I want to explore how EPPC views itself in this moment, given its focus on traditional values and the Judeo Christian principles. So, for that conversation, I'm very happy to have Ryan Anderson, who has been president of EPPC for the past 5 years. And before that, had a long tenure at the Heritage Foundation. And he thinks and writes about all of these issues regularly and with aplomb. Ryan, so glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I didn't realize Sam was just on. Sam has been a friend of mine, I don't know, maybe 20 years now. It was when I did my first, he was at the Acton Institute at the time. So it was the Towards a Free and Virtuous Society seminar that they run. I want to say I did that seminar around 2006. So that would have been like 20 years ago now.
Well,
And,
he was
Sam was
there
like
for
the main
20 years
faculty.
before or 20 plus years before he went over to AIER, and
Yeah.
brings a lot of that ethos and merges it. And so I think it's a good complement to the discussion that we're going to have. Now, EPPC was founded 50 years ago, which puts it right in that era of the Weather Underground and bombings, and the Watergate scandal had just happened. I'm just curious how much of those political scandals, how much of that kind of violence that was in the air then in the late 70s, that cultural malaise, how much did that influence an organization called the Ethics and Public
Yeah.
Policy Center?
My understanding of the founding was that it was initially much more focused on foreign policy concerns and some of those domestic concerns that you mentioned, although not exclusively. I mean, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary gala, so we don't do an annual gala, but we'll do one on the 40th. We just did one on the 50th. We'll, God willing, do one on the 60th. And part of this process, we hired historian to go through the archive, and we don't have any history of EPPC. When I was at the Heritage Foundation, it was like, every decade, Lee Edwards would be writing like a new updated history of, heritage and, profile of Ed Fulner, profile of the other founders. We didn't have any of that. So it's not yet published, but, he went back. It was Ernie Lefebvre who was our founder, and he was a Protestant political theologian, in essence, theological political thinker. And he was housed at Georgetown at the time. And it's interesting to think of how much Georgetown has changed in the past 50 years. But he was largely focused on the Cold War, and focused on education, and focused on the church's engagement in the public square. And so three of the main priority issues for EPPC at the time of the founding was education, the churches in the public square, and then foreign policy. Particularly because, this is at the height of the Cold War. This is at the height of the kind of blame America first mantra. And what Ernie wanted to argue was that America and the West is worth defending because she's good, right? Not just because she's ours, right? There is something that you should love your fatherland because it's yours, it's your fatherland. But it's also, there's something about America that is fundamentally good, fundamentally true, fundamentally beautiful. And it comes from that marriage of both a a philosophical tradition and a theological tradition. And we'll celebrate the 4th of July. And, we'll recognize that there are certain truths that are self-evident, that we're created, which implies that we're creatures. There's a creator. We're created equal, and we're endowed by the creator with certain inalienable rights. Right? That's the result of a philosophical and a theological tradition to get us to that moment. It was on our bicentenary year that Ernie started EPPC, and those truths were being questioned. And now we're at the 250th anniversary of the founding, and they're still being questioned. And they're being questioned in new and, I would say, more extreme ways. People on both the left and the right seem to have given up on the American project. And we now have all sorts of anthropological debates, right? So it's not just about political theology or political philosophy. It's now about human nature itself, and I think that's something that you'll see in our 50 years of much more focused, I would say, today on the nature of the human person. Simply because, I think think about it, Pope Leo just released this new encyclical, and the driving question in an age of AI is, what does it mean to be human? And it's not just AI, right? There are a whole host of other developments in the past 50 years that we could talk about. So yeah,
Well, yeah,
that's a little bit about it. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, about what does it mean to be human in an era when factories close, when jobs become just service jobs that are like robots but not robots? You're right. It is a lot bigger than just AI, and I guess that kind of gets to the heart of some of the things that you talk about. You're not really doing foreign policy so much anymore, but what are the areas where you're really focused today?
Yeah, I would say to a certain extent, we're focused on many of the necessary preconditions for liberty, and for liberty to flourish, meaning things like the family, things like education, things like the churches. Right? You need all of those institutions to be really healthy and strong in order for ordered liberty to be possible. Right? And I think this is something distinctive about the American tradition, is that there needed to be a lot of non-governmental institutions. And I would say that the family, the church, and the school would be at the top of the list, that need to be flourishing and really going well in order to allow liberty to be possible. Because otherwise, think about what happens if the family falls apart. You get the government trying to step in and pick up the pieces, right? And you see this in the form of the welfare state and the police state. And what is the welfare state and the police state doing? It's trying to replace a missing father and a missing husband. And right, and the husband and the father would have been historically the provider and the disciplinarian, and instead you now have government trying to fill the gaps. Something similar you could explain, what happens with education falling, and you just look at the results of public education, and even some of the private schools. What happens when church attendance declines? And you get this form of young, particularly men, who are just adrift in culture. And it's a huge problem, right? And it's something we have to reckon with. So I would say those are three of the perennial issues that EPPC has been working on: family, education, churches. Two of the things, and maybe I'll mention three, but two in particular that took new form during the 5 years that I've been here has been some of our work on technology. And we've always done work on technology. We've always done work on bioethics. A lot of the scholars who were involved in the Leon Cass Bioethics Commission, the President's Council on Bioethics during the George W. Bush administration, when they left office, they came to EPPC. And I'm thinking of people like Yuval Levin, Eric Cohen, Adam Kuiper, helped launch the New Atlantis with Yuval and Eric. Carter Snead came to EPPC, right? So Ed Whalen, previous president, was very good at recruiting a bunch of Bush staffers who had served in the Bioethics Commission. And then, Leon Cass, well, he never came to EPPC. He was writing in the New Atlantis, issue after issue. So we've always done a lot of reflection on technology and bioethics. And I would say today it's been a huge focus on digital technology, a focus on smartphones, on social media, on online obscenity. Claire Morell is our main scholar doing work there. And it's just done wonderful work helping parents understand some of the risks of giving your child a smartphone or signing them up for a social media account prematurely. And then some of the policy solutions, which are largely about empowering parents, preventing tech companies from having a contract with your child without the parent approving of this, right? The whole age verification, parental consent law. So that's been one project. The other project has been engaging with the administrative state. A lot of conservatives rightly think that the administrative state either shouldn't exist or it should be a lot smaller than it is. And therefore, because they think it either shouldn't exist or it should be smaller, they don't engage with it. And our approach was during the Obama years, and then I became president on February 1st of 2021, so a few weeks into the Biden administration. And, we saw what had happened during the Obama years of most of the religious liberty violations at the federal level did not come from Congress. They came from the alphabet soup agencies, the administrative state, the HHS mandate, the transgender mandate, the contraception mandate. And I had a donor who said to me, what can you guys do to prevent these things that Obama did from coming back during the Biden year? Trump got rid of them, but we know Biden. And the idiom of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think in the philanthropy world, it might be something like, a couple $100,000 of regulatory engagement is worth a couple millions of litigation later on. Because, if the bad reg goes into effect, you then need ADF or Beckett or First Liberty, or a private law firm, even more expensive, right, to litigate these cases. And
not to mention all the people who have to pay out of pocket to deal with that until it may get overturned, and it may not.
And even if they win, I remember one of the things that, I would say when I did a lot of talking about the Little Sisters of the Poor case, the Hobby Lobby case, the baker, the florist, the photographer, is that the process is part of the punishment. Even if you win, going through a decade of litigation simply to vindicate your right to, freely operate your adoption agency or your nursing home or your bakery or your photography studio, that alone, like Jack Phillips is not a professional activist. He's a cake artist, and he spent a decade in court. 3 different times he's been sued, right? And Little Sisters of the Poor have gone up to the Supreme Court. I think it's at least 3, and there's another case pending. So anyway, yes, I would say the regulatory state and what our scholars there, it's Rachel Morrison, it's Eric Niffen, it's Sam Lucas. They've created a network of allied organizations who, their issue area might just be like, they particularly care about this reg or they care about that reg, this issue, that issue. More or less every regulation coming out of, the Biden administration, now the Trump administration, that touches on human dignity, human nature, human identity. So, abortion stuff, transgender ideology, marriage in the family. And we just filed a comment earlier this week on assisted suicide. And it's important now in the Trump era that they want to get good regulations enacted, but there's a regulatory law. It's the Administrative Procedures Act. You have to go through the APA, which means there's a notice and comment period. We have to file comments to support the good stuff in the Trump rules. We try to meet with them beforehand so that the rules that they propose are, already ironed out in a good way. In a couple of cases, we've been able to help them improve these, up front, using the right language, using the right legal mechanisms. Then we have to, defend it during the notice and comment period, et cetera, et cetera. So blocking bad regulations during the Biden years and now helping our friends inside of the Trump administration enact good regulations, these make a world of difference. If you care about human flourishing, you care about liberty, you care about the preconditions of liberty. And so those are a couple of the big buckets of what we're
it's so
engaging
interesting.
in.
You talk about the couple of $100,000 upfront payment and donation, donor work that can be done to save millions of dollars on the back end. I think that's really interesting. I look at EPPC and you look at the Judeo-Christian principles, the talk of culture, et cetera, and then you're like, and they also do a bunch in science, and they're also doing this regulatory work. And at first blush, you say, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But as you say, the regulatory work to a certain extent is living out the old Buckley aphorism of standing at history yelling stop, or at least yelling, hey, slow down. Let's make sure we get it right before we just launch it. Let's not just march into
and both of those
something.
things, in both the science and the regulatory stuff, it flows because we have a certain worldview. We have a certain vision of the human person, of human identity, of human flourishing. And where could these things go off the rails? Well, we saw during the Obama year a radically different vision of the human person being imposed via the regulatory state. We've seen, various biotechnologies, whether it was embryo destructive stem cell research, whether it was cloning technology. Now, I believe it was Columbia University has successfully gene edited a human embryo. And, we need to start thinking through designer babies are, one step closer. And so the biotechnology and the regulatory state is where many of kind of natural law, Judeo-Christian ethical principles, the rubber hits the road. And
Yeah,
I mentioned
I
that
think
phrase natural law just because like we try to do this in both a philosophical and a theological language to be accessible to, as wide of an audience as possible. So we can speak both confessionally to our fellow believers, but we can also speak in a purely philosophical language to anyone who's willing to entertain an argument, anyone who's willing to be rational.
in the science, the technology, it's so intertwined with what culture is today, with our policy decisions. Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of the New Atlantis, which is spun out of EPPC, or is it housed in EPPC? A little bit of both.
A little bit of both. So it started at EPPC probably over 20 years ago now, and Eric Cohen, Yuval, Adam Kuiper were all involved in that. And then it was a couple of years before I came to EPPC. It went independent, as a separate 501c3, but it's still run out of our offices. So they now sublet an office rather than having it's same exact office that they used to have. And then the back cover of the journal has both logos, just to kind of recognize that, for 20 years, it was an EPPC sponsored journal. And,
And
there's a
if you're
part
not
of me
getting
that
it, I mean,
wishes,
it's a weighty, it's nice to feel, nice feel. You open it up, there's great, thoughtful articles, and
it's
it
awesome.
shows this intersection of how we have to consider these things. And it doesn't even, I'm reading one on, farming, regenerative farming
Yeah,
right now,
yeah.
right? And I think it does a nice job, and this is not always evident on, I would say, on the conservative side. It's, well, that's bad, or we would also spend enough time diving down the rabbit hole to understand what is this bringing? What is AI bringing? What is this technology bringing? And then let's look at it, the good and the bad, and weigh it all.
No, it's a really good journal. I think I've only written for them once or twice, personally, but, I read every quarterly issue. It really does thoughtful work. And it's important that, conservatives be doing this work. We can't just ignore all of science and technology. I mean, we live in a
Right.
technological era. And if conservatives, particularly social conservatives, aren't engaged in thinking through how can technology be utilized in ways that enhance human flourishing, that enhance liberty, that enhance dignity, rather than ways that detract from it? And to a certain extent, like I think that's the central driving question of Leo's recent encyclical. It's not just on AI. People refer to it as the AI encyclical. It's on Catholic social thought, and then it's as applied to some questions of technology today. But that's really the driving question for our time. What does it mean to be human? What does human flourishing look like? What does human dignity require of us? Um, yeah.
Okay, so let's parlay that into kind of some of the broader debates going on within the conservative movement, the right broadly defined. We talk a lot about fusionism. We talk about the libertarian side of it, the traditionalist side of it, and how they fuse together to create really a winning coalition for a long time. And Stephanie Slade would be mad if I said coalition in terms of just a political thing, but just in the way we thought about things. We wanted
Yes.
freedom and liberty, and we wanted it done in the right way. EPC kind of embodies a lot of that. You've been there at EPPC 5 years. You were at Heritage before that. Heritage has changed a lot in the last 5 years. I'm sure EPPC has changed a lot under your watch, and then the broader landscape just
The
continues
whole
to
world
have
has
this
changed.
push
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
pull. So I'm curious what you have seen over the last 5 years, and in this ongoing divide between national conservatives, freedom conservatives, if we want to boil it down to that, EPPC's work seems to be respected by both sides. How are you walking that tightrope? And or is that intentional? How do you think about all this? It's a
Yeah.
lot. So take that in any
No,
direction you want.
it's a big question. And I mean, I'm glad you have the observation that, I think you said something like EBBC's work seems to be respected by both FreeCons and NatCons. And that is our goal. We would like to be able to produce scholarship, to produce model legislation that um, uh, a new fusion. I mean, to a certain extent, like we're engaged in a new fusionism at this moment, right? And so you have the FreeCons, you have the NatCons, you have various populists. There, Henry Olson is, our kind of like in-house political coalition poll watcher, electioneer guy. I mean,
One
he
of the
knows
smartest political
he is so
thinkers
good.
out there.
Yes, and that's why I struggle to even like what is like the one word description of what he does. He has like precinct level knowledge on election night. For people who are watching the polls, he gets the various coalitions, the various factions, the various faces of the conservative movement, Republican Party. And to a certain extent, like there was Fusionism 1.0. Henry talks about Fusionism 2.0, or new Fusionism. I think we try to embody this both theoretically. So like Henry is doing some of the theory of this. He currently hosts a podcast called The Crossroads of Conservatism, where he will get people on more the NatCon side and more the FreeCon side to actually discuss civilly and intelligently, and like not just paper over their differences, but also not just like yell at each other. And before that, he had an in-person debate series that was titled something. It wasn't Crossroads of Conservatism. I forget now the name, but if you do a Google search for Henry, EPPC, and conservatism debates, it'll all pop up. But like that's intentional, because part of Henry's argument is that none of the factions on the center right is powerful enough alone to win without the other ones. That it needs to be a coalition if you want our people to be in power. If you care about winning elections and governing, then whatever flavor of conservative you would primarily identify with, whether it's foreign policy conservatism or fiscal conservatism or social conservatism or national populism or freedom conservative or national, whatever, you can't win without the others. And so we actually need to find a way to work together. And that means we need to better understand where we agree and where we disagree and why we disagree and how we can find more common ground. So that's kind of Henry's project at EPPC. But then for our other scholars, the advice, the mentorship I've offered them is, if you think parents should be in the driver's seat when it comes to their children's exposure to technology, well, you want to convince both the FreeCons and the NatCons of that proposition. If you think unborn babies should not be killed in the womb, well, you want both the FreeCons and the NatCons to embrace that proposition, right? And so if you think, Stanley Kurtz is our education scholar, and Stanley's been doing a lot of work, not just on school choice, which is what a lot of education analysts do. He's focused 85% of Americans still go to the government-run schools. What can we do to make those government-run public schools less bad? And so he has a variety of model legislation that he wants both the FreeCons and the NatCons to embrace, right? So like it's both at the theoretical level and the coalitional level, some of what Henry's doing, but then on the discrete policies, we want the whole fusionist spectrum to support this, because I think to a certain extent these need to be touchstones that all conservatives believe. There's going to be a different level of prioritization, right? Whatever the given issue is, it might be higher on a list of priority if you're more on the FreeCon than the NatCon side. Last thing I'll say about this question is, I've now been here 5 years, and so there are a lot of new scholars at EPPC, people who I've hired and I've fundraised for to bring them here, and I would say we have internally, like, we're a fusionist think tank in the sense of some of our scholars probably lean more in a NatCon direction, some of our scholars probably lean more in a FreeCon direction, but all of them get along with each other. None of them try to undermine each other. And we try to find ways of writing and speaking and proposing policy that would be appealing to both sides of that divide. And that is very
Why do you think that is? What can the internal workings of EPPC teach the broader right about having a more productive dialogue about where we really want to get to?
Yeah, one thing here, it goes to one of our former colleagues, Yuval Levin, and Yuval, I don't want to say he was stolen, but he was kind of stolen from us. And I don't blame Robert Dorr. I mean, Robert's a friend, and Robert became president of AEI, and Robert wanted to hire someone to run their social, cultural, constitutional program, and there's no one better than Yuval, right? So I don't blame him for offering Yuval a very attractive job, right? And I would love if we still had Yuval, but Yuval wrote a really important book, A Time to Build, and one of the distinctions that he draws are our institutions primarily platforms, or are they, I think it's molds. He says, too many people view their institutions as platforms on which they perform for an audience. And his most recent book, which is on the Constitution, he says this is part of the problem right now with Congress, is that people, run for election to be a senator or a congressman, so then they can go on Fox News and be a pundit. And they treat the institution as a platform for them to kind of like build a personal brand. And he says the alternative is that we should think of our institutions as molds that shape us and that form us, and that we're stewards of institutions, right? We come into institutions. I came into institutions that had a 45-year history, and I don't get to willy-nilly remake it. I'm a steward of an institution, of those who came before me, and therefore it's supposed to shape me. And so to a certain extent, I think like a lot of our scholars, we have George Weigel has been at EPPC for over 35 years. He was our second president, and he never left. Ed Whalen has been at EPPC for over 20 years. He was a president for 17 years, and then he never left, right? And so people who have been shaped by the institution, who therefore aren't, I think some of the infighting that we see are people trying to make a name for themselves. And so very much like a platform on which they can perform. And therefore it's much more about tearing someone else down to rise up. And I just find that it's just counter to my disposition, my nature. And I would say for many of my colleagues, it's just like not in our blood. That's not our disposition. We want to do serious thinking and serious writing and serious, policy proposals. And then we want to work with allies. We're not as concerned with like who gets credit. Like we just want to see good stuff get done. And it's a different mindset, I think.
And there's a lot of skepticism around institutions these days, actually probably more on the national conservative side than the freedom conservative side, I think. And a lot of, let's just tear it down and rebuild it. How does EPPC, you seem to come down more pro institution and kind of get in there and fix things from the inside. Is that fair?
Yeah, so another example of this, actually I have two. One with EPPC. My wife was the one who encouraged me to take the job. Ed Whalen, had recruited me to be his successor, and then the board kind of, interviews me and, puts me through that process. And my wife was like, look, you're always saying that there aren't enough people like you out there. Like you have an opportunity to take an institution that like you've always said, like even when I was at Heritage, I always kind of said like, I'm more of an EPPC style scholar. And like, she's like, now you can go there and you can, some of it involved changing the business model. EPPC was an eat what you kill think tank where each scholar raised their own support. That was actually why I was never there. I never thought I could thrive on that business model. And so, Ed convinced me to come over and not just raise my own support, but raise everyone's support. Because part of what I've done in 5 years, especially for like the younger scholars, the newer scholars, is there's a different mindset of if you're offered a job, one with a salary and one where you're kind of treated like a missionary and like, come to EPPC and raise your own salary, like not a very attractive job offer. But if I could say, look, do work that really matters, and I promise you, I'll find the resources to support your work. And so you don't need to be doing kind of like performative stuff to increase your Twitter following, to like, gin up algorithm, like do work that matters. And like, we have internal ways of thinking about what's meaningful work. And then I'll be able to pitch it to benefactors.
Heritage Foundation is very much a one voice think tank. Everybody's singing from the same songbook. And then AEI is very intentionally the opposite. Everyone's kind of free market, but you say what you're going to say and you're here because you're a smart person. And then Cato is probably somewhere in the middle where everyone's got the same worldview. The song, everyone kind of knows the tune, but some of them sing it a little bit differently. And there can be some internal debate. Where does EPPC fall in kind of that spectrum?
So EPPC, like we don't have a one voice policy in the way that when I was at Heritage, it was like literally one voice, meaning everything I published, someone, I had two different people, my director and my vice president would have to read it and sign off on it before it was published. And, part of what they were looking for is that, does everything here adhere to and congru with, Heritage kind of like platform in essence. For EPPC, like there's no like pre-review. Scholars publish their own stuff. I largely read it afterwards. People will send me stuff if they want feedback ahead of time, and I'm happy to do that. But you don't have to get clearance from like a supervisor before you publish. But what we do have agreement on are the fundamentals. Everyone at EPPC, at least publicly, again, I don't like, investigate people's hearts, but everyone at least publicly is pro-life. Everyone's pro-marriage. everyone is against gender ideology. Everyone is in favor of religious liberty. Everyone is in favor of market economy, right? No socialists, no communists. Everyone's in favor of the Constitution. No living constitutionalists. But then, what happens when you have to apply these principles? We have scholars who have disagreed about various aspects of pro-life policy in this very challenging moment of time post-Dobbs. What is the way forward for the pro-life movement when we lost 14 out of 17 of the ballot initiatives? And different scholars are going to have different takes on this is the best way forward. And I think disagreement there is entirely appropriate. It's entirely appropriate for scholars who are morally serious, who agree on the fundamental human dignity question, to have disagreements at the margins when it comes to how do we advance this policy? How do we best advance religious liberty? We have scholars who disagree about who their top pick might be for a judgeship, or if we had a judicial vacancy for a justice, right? But they're all coming from the same judicial philosophy. But it may be that they rank individual potential judges and justices differently. To your earlier question, part of it was, taking institutions seriously. So, stepping into a leadership role for EPPC where, I have not been able to do nearly as much of my own reading and writing and speaking as when I was just a senior fellow. But, what my wife had encouraged me was that you have a chance to steward a meaningful institution to, in essence, jumpstart the careers of 5, 10, 15, 20 people. And, we're probably at the 5 to 10 stage right now, and God willing, we'll keep going. And after 10 years of being president, 15 years of being a president, there could easily be an entire generation of scholars who we've been able to cultivate. The other part that I wanted to say is it was about 4 years ago that I got a phone call from the governor's office of Florida, a staffer for Ron DeSantis, who said, would you be willing to serve as a trustee of one of the state universities in Florida, New College of Florida? And New College was the first public university in Florida that, in essence, was taken over. And the proposition here was, when you say, should we just give up on institutions or should we reform them, was why should state universities in red states be as woke as the Ivy League? Right? And I went to Princeton. Princeton's not in great shape. Harvard's not in great shape. Yale's not in great shape. Why should the University of Florida or the University of Texas at Austin or the New College of Florida be as progressive, as woke as the other places? And the answer is it shouldn't, right? Public universities are accountable to the public. And one of the ways that the accountability manifests itself is that both the governor, the board of governors, they get to appoint trustees. And then we get to, in essence, the most important thing we do is hire and fire a president. And then we're the ones who vote to either grant or not grant tenure, right? And we took that responsibility very, very seriously. And our first meeting, we got rid of the previous president, not because of anything she had necessarily done wrong, but simply because we said, look, there's no way that you could implement and execute our vision. And so since we now have a distinct vision of what we want, and the other new board members, it was Matt Spalding from Hillsdale, it was Charles Kessler from Claremont, it was
Chris Rufo was part of that.
Chris Rufo was part of it. And then Mark Bowerlin, a former English professor from Emory, a current senior editor at First Things. We just said, look, we have a certain vision of what an honors college at Florida should look like. And we want to be able to hire our own person to then implement it. And we're now 4 years into this. And the proof is in the pudding. The school has been turned around. And it's attracting lots of professors who want to teach there, lots of students. So I think, again, building off of what Yuval wrote in A Time to Build, this is a time for us to step into these public institutions, hold them accountable, reform them. There are so many. Robbie George is one of my mentors, a co-author of mine. We've written books together, law review articles together. And Robbie started the James Madison program at Princeton. And there are now, I don't know, maybe 20 different state universities that have these civic centers that are modeled on the Madison program. And, give this a generation. And again, the proof will be in the pudding of what type of students are now being produced because of these reforms. Rather than giving up on these institutions, we sought to reform them where we could.
So, kind of landing the plane here, what is next for EPPC, but for the message that EPPC is carrying forward in terms of this broader conversation on the right and your role in it, and lots going to change in the next few years. What do you think is coming down the pike?
Yeah, a lot. So I think we need to shore up the family. We see marriage rates continue to decline. We see fertility rates continue to decline. And I would say the fertility rate is largely a reflection of the marriage rate, because marital fertility is much higher than non-marital. And so if you got more people to be married and to stay married, we would be at replacement level fertility, but we're not at replacement level. And that's going to be a huge economic problem,
Plus,
where
people get married later, so they start having
later,
children
and if you
later, which
start
means they
later,
have
you have
fewer
fewer kids.
children.
Yes. Yep. So all of that, I mean, I think, Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia has done so much good work here. Mark Regnerus has our family scholar. Patrick Brown is our primary point person on this. A variety of ways in which we can think about how to make family formation more achievable for more people. So I think family formation's vitally important. I think how we navigate technology, whether it's digital technology, the devices in our pockets, smartphones, social media, but also now artificial intelligence. And that's something I'm trying to increasingly wrap my own head around. Last October, I was at a Rome summit on AI and ethics. So some of my own kind of like free time reading is trying to get caught up to speed on this. We have other scholars, Aaron Cariotti, Claire Morell at EPPC doing work there. I think physician-assisted suicide is something that we're not prepared for, but it's coming, especially as the baby boomers enter retirement. And this is linked to family formation. I think for people who are retiring, whose families have fragmented because of divorce, people who are retiring and who are estranged from their adult children, or they didn't have like it's scary to think about approaching the end of life without having those inbuilt support systems. And it's not a government. So it's right, family. It's civil society. It's a church. It's a synagogue. It's your children. It's your grandchildren. And I think the pressures are going to be very high for one, the legalization of this, and we've already seen state after state after state who've allowed this. But then the second is the coercion, and we have a scholar at EPPC, Sasha Rakin, who's a Canadian and Israeli citizen, Canadian citizen. So we kind of sponsored him for a work visa here because he's doing the best work exposing just the horrors of assisted suicide in Canada and why we shouldn't be importing this to the United States. And so anyway, those would be three different areas of kind of like what's next. And then the overarching theme is that we need to do this in a fusionist way. I don't care if you're a FreeCon or a NatCon, we shouldn't have markets and killing grandma, right? It would corrupt our healthcare system. It would place perverse financial incentives if tools that are meant for healing could also be deployed for killing, right? And so I'm in favor of markets, but I don't want markets and killing. And I think whether you're FreeCon or not NatCon, we have to agree on that bedrock, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with a right to life. Like we got to vindicate that in our public policy and law. So that's going to be our approach to this: is trying to bridge some of those divides where we can.
Well, it seems like EPPC steps into the gray space. Maybe this is part of the reason I've had trouble getting my head around everything you do in the past, is because you are actually willing to talk in this gray space of, there is a moral imperative on the family and marriage. And yet we also have the discussion that maybe some people aren't going to get married. What does that mean? Dynamics have changed, the economic situation. We have to have the discussion. Same on suicide. Yeah, suicide is wrong. It's pretty clear. And yet there's these weird, intimate decisions that have to be made. And how do you deal with it? And AI is AI, right?
Yeah, no, we're all getting caught up to speed there. Like none of us have wrapped
right. It changes every day. And so to be able to be in that gray space of facilitating those conversations and allowing the nuance to come out. Nobody likes nuance anymore. So if EPPC can be the nuance generator, that would be a huge boon to the movement.
Yeah. No,
and
I
to
love
America.
That. Yeah. No, it's funny because like my friends who are like more MAGA think I'm like a never Trump squish, and my friends who are more never Trump think I'm like a MAGA radical. And it's just like, wait a minute. And it's that the gray space or the nuance, like to a certain extent, like all of my colleagues are in that same area. And it's challenging, but I just think that has to be the way forward.
And you know what? It's the space to be in because you win eventually. The pendulum swings back and forth, and so you stay grounded.
Yeah. Cool.
So, Ryan, this is terrific. Thank you for all the work that you guys are doing at Ethics and Public Policy Center, and great to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's fun to catch up.
Well, that conversation was certainly helpful for me to better understand what Ethics and Public Policy Center is. I'll admit it's one of these organizations that I have known about and known existed for a long time. I've heard terrific things about. I've even met with Ryan before and yet had my troubles getting my head fully around the work that it does. But that conversation helped me a lot, particularly that point that of clarification that you heard me thinking in real time at the end of how they exist in this gray space and this nuanced space that is so lacking in today's American discourse and on not just on the right, but broadly everywhere. And kind of goes back to some of the elements of the conversation I had with Sarah Cross about what they're trying to do with Be the People and getting people to have a conversation with each other, some of the same notes that we touched on with Sam Gregg. So you're seeing these themes of this need and indeed this desire for people to be able to talk with each other without arguing, without yelling, a little bit more than they are doing now. And hopefully we can start trending in that direction. And I'm sure EPPC will be an important part of getting us there. Well, I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you'll rate and review the podcast if you are willing to do such a thing. It's a small act of charity that helps the podcast to find new audiences and expand and not just grow the audience. That's great. But what we really want to grow are people giving to these sorts of organizations, to efforts like EPPC and AIER and the dozens of organizations that we featured here on the Giving Ventures podcast. It's the type of organizations that we work with on a daily basis at Donors Trust, that our clients that we work with through their donor advised funds are supporting in ways big and small to advance these things we care about: limited government, personal responsibility, free enterprise. And if you aren't already working with us and are looking for a better way to manage your philanthropy, or just curious that if there is a better way to manage your philanthropy, we are always eager to talk. You can go to donorstrust.org, reach out to us through the website, schedule a call with us through the website so that we can have a conversation, explore what we do and how it may help you, because that is why we exist, to help conservative and libertarian donors be more effective with their philanthropy. And we'd love to help you with that. And hopefully these conversations are helpful, and we will have another one in just a couple of weeks. We're releasing this into the teeth of the 4th of July and the semi-quincentennial. And so if you are listening to this around that time, I hope you enjoy your 4th. I hope you celebrate 250 years of this great American experiment. And if you're listening after, well, that experiment continues and it's worth celebrating every day. So until the next time we talk, thank you for being a giver. We'll talk more soon.